it the same. One thing that I'll touch on here in just a second once we get into the opening piece of it will be how many actual topics we're going to be covering today. But we're going to do the same 2-hour format with about a 5 to 10 minute break in the middle for us all to get up and get some refreshment. Of course, everybody is more than welcome to get up and go to the bathroom as you need to. You certainly won't be disturbing me if you do that. And then after the end of the second hour, we're going to be breaking up into our respective groups like we did. Adults will stay here for a workout or a workshop breakout session with myself, Steve and Amber, and then Wendy will be taking different groups into different places and talking through a little bit more of this. So please, by all means, ask your questions. This is certainly meant to be interactive as much as you need it to be and want it to be. You don't have to save that for our workshop times in the last hour that will come. But if you want, by all means, write your questions down. This book is yours to keep, so annotate whatever you want, and that way you can remember what those questions were and we can ask them at the appropriate time. All right. So, saving this slide from the last time because we are actually going to be completing our time in the Torah throughout this quarter. If you've had a chance to actually sneak a peek at how the lesson material is broken down, we spend quite a bit of our time in the books of Exodus and Numbers. We only have one Sunday in Leviticus, and that's focusing on chapter 6. We virtually spend no time in the book of Deuteronomy, so you'll see throughout the material today, I have tried to plug in quite a few excerpts, passages from Deuteronomy as supplemental material for you so you can kind of see how they can be plugged and played into different areas of where we'll be teaching and focusing on. So that way we don't completely exclude the book of Deuteronomy. And of course, there will be a Sunday or two that we're going to be using other materials outside the Old Testament, maybe some gospel or epistle material. But nonetheless, our goals will be pretty much the same. To come together to get a better understanding of the main themes of the Torah, to get a better feel for how these themes influence the patterns used by the author, and to see how the foundational stories of the Torah form the backdrop of the biblical narrative moving forward. And then we recognize the need for bringing these concepts to bear as we teach the Bible to our students, pondering all these things so that they help us and them come to be better disciples, of course, and disciple makers. That, in large part, is what our responsibility is as teachers. And this is just a reminder of what we're striving for. Stepping back and trying to help our students get a much better feel for how the biblical narrative comes together and how to see these concepts and themes interplay with one another. It's not lost on me the frustration that many of us might feel when we like to get intimately immersed in a book, like we've just done with Genesis, spending several weeks in that. But as you've noticed with last week and this week, we're starting to skip a lot more of the chapters in between. And some of our students in our classes may feel some of that frustration. But I think if we're focusing more on the meta-narrative, the big picture, then that can help our students kind of be soothed a little bit as goes passing by larger swaths of Scripture, if we're able to connect what's come before to what we're seeing now, and even launch for them a vision of the trajectory of where this story is moving on in the future, and to continue to reinforce and reiterate these things in a repetitive fashion so that way, because God knows we all need a little help sometimes keeping this all straight, we are making our students mindful of how this story connects to that, that story connects to this, and it brings the picture all together in a more cohesive fashion. All right, so focusing on the left side of the screen, these three new topics of the Exodus, the Messiah, the wilderness, that's where we're going to be spending the bulk of our time. I'm recycling the last 6 topics that we talked about from our session nearly a quarter ago, but I'm going to be very brief in covering those topics so we can spend more time on our 3 new topics. And if need be, if I run out of time, I'm going to stop talking at the end of our second hour. I'm not going to take away from our workshop time. So if there's 1 or 2 of those topics at the end, say anything from priesthood to atonement that I don't get a chance to cover, you have all the material there in your book that I think you would need. And of course, I'm always free for open dialogue and chatting outside of this forum. But if need be, we will sacrifice those for the sake of getting through these new topics today. All right, let's jump right in. This is the biggest one. If there was one that I wanted you to really get a good grasp on, it's this theme that we're going to be covering right here of the Exodus. Now, I know that a lot of us have a tendency to think of the Exodus mainly when we wind up getting to the book that shares that title. But I hope that what we'll come away with today is a deeper understanding of the fact the theme of the Exodus is something that's been laid down in many different ways throughout the book of Genesis. Much of this material we've already covered. I hope that through this as well, you'll feel a level of comfort if, having passed through that material, you never thought of even seeing the Exodus, much less mentioning the Exodus as part of the topic there, that you'll be willing to go back and pull some of that material forward as we start to dive into this theme in the Exodus when we actually go through this book. Case in point, the theme of the Exodus itself obviously begins in the book of Abraham. Now, just as an aside, you'll see on your handout that little slide that I just clicked on that's now taking up the entire screen for you. Those are appendices at the end of your handout. So once you get past the resources pages, you'll actually see these blown up in larger size for you, because can't do that in the handout that you have, but that way you're not skipping out on the material. So you'll see several slides that have that. So if I blow that up for you, know that whatever I'm referencing is back in that appendices section. All right, so the theme of the Exodus, it truly is embedded all throughout the book of Genesis. Every one of these bubbles that I've given you around that center circle are examples of where you see this theme already being laid down for us, all right? Not going to take the time to necessarily go through all of these, but one in particular that I definitely want to bring attention to is the parallel between Abraham's journey in Genesis 12 all the way through 22, because it's one large representation of the Exodus theme itself. It's unpacked in a few different places, but it starts more poignantly for us in Genesis chapter 12. Now, to kind of summarize this for you real quickly, what I want you to gather away from this theme is that the theme of the Exodus, having already been laid down at several places or points for us in Genesis, now gets drawn out. It gets pronounced in a much more aggrandized way in the actual book of Exodus, and the journey of the people of Israel from Egypt eventually to the Promised Land, all the struggles that ensue from leaving Egypt to getting to Sinai, and of course Sinai over the next 40 years until they're on the brink of the Jordan, getting ready to cross over into the Promised Land. And what I hope that you'll also see with this as well is this story serves as something of a larger backdrop for what God's plan and intended purpose is for all humanity. A theme I tried to lay down more as a subplot in our last go-around together was the idea of Israel being a microcosm. That what you're seeing with Israel is a diorama that God is playing out with all of humanity once we get past the story of Israel and Jesus coming onto the scene and fulfilling all of Israel's mandate, and with that, launching a new Exodus. And we'll see that here in just a second. I'm going to bring up some slides for you that show us basically how the gospel material is laid out, and much of that follows this format, this rubric of an Exodus, all right? So this is an incredibly powerful theme that unites almost the entire corpus of Scripture onto one huge backbone of stories that's recycling this theme again and again. And the more that we can point this out for our students, the better we are able to take some of these other subplots from the Exodus story itself and see where we fit in as disciples in this current kingdom that we live in. One of the more profound examples of this theme being laid down in Exodus actually is the story of Abraham, again, beginning in Genesis chapter 12. I've tried to parallel this for you as goes the story of Abraham and the story of the people of Israel once we launch into the actual Exodus story itself. Abraham, Genesis 12, after he gets his commission, he goes down into the land of Egypt. So we have a migration. The same thing will eventually happen with the people that come from him. At the end of Genesis, which we're about to touch on in Sunday school, we've got Jacob and the 70-ish people that are all part of his camp, which of course are his sons and their children, all wind up going down to Egypt per God's blessing. They flourish there over a period of centuries, and eventually they wind up becoming subjugated, enslaved, and eventually they get delivered, but that's still part of the same thing, a migration down into Egypt. While Abraham is in Egypt, he experiences a threat against the covenant promises. Sarai is taken away from him, and of course this was because he wound up lying and so forth, but nonetheless, Sarai is the chosen vessel, the conduit by which the son of promise is supposed to enter into the world. And of course, the seed that are going to be counted through Isaac are the ones that wind up coming through Jacob. So once they wind up being enslaved in the land, and we get to this moment where we have Pharaoh attempting to try to completely snuff out an entire generation, notice that it's the focus on the men, not so much the women. That Pharaoh in the Abram story wants to keep the woman. Now, of course, he doesn't wind up bringing a threat against Abram and actually threaten to kill him, but that's Abram's legitimate fear, nonetheless. But that is exactly what the Pharaoh of the oppression winds up doing. He wants to kill all the men, but yet he makes an allowance to keep the daughters alive. Perhaps a part of that will be the assimilation of these Hebrew women into their own society, a complete eradication of the actual Hebrew race in and of itself for the sake of making the Egyptians stronger by using these women to become childbearing vessels. Then in the Genesis 12 story, we've got Abram here with God bringing plagues upon Egypt because of Abram's mistake nonetheless. But the idea is that this foreshadows what God is eventually going to wind up doing with the children of Israel in bringing them out of Egypt. If you've ever asked that question, why is it that God seemingly strikes Egypt in a rather unfair way? I mean, yeah, Pharaoh's not an innocent guy. He's got his own problems. He's a sinner like everybody else. But it seems almost unjust the way that God handles this, because Abram's the one that slipped up. Pharaoh did what he thought he was lawfully allowed to do in taking this man's sister as his wife. So why does God basically wind up oppressing the whole land through bringing plagues into the scenario that egregiously affect Pharaoh in the land in a very profound way that they take notice of what's going on here? Because this foreshadows what God is going to do centuries later when he winds up bringing judgment upon Egypt again in the same way with plagues in a much more pronounced way. And then eventually it results in a migration out of Egypt. Obviously, you've got Abram being sent away. And again, we ask the question, why does Abraham get to keep the bride price that was paid for Sarai when that transaction eventually falls apart? Pharaoh gives Sarai back to Abram, and you would think he would have a right to demand the bride price back since he had done nothing to her or with her. He paid for a wife. He didn't get a wife. Abraham is sent away with way more than he wound up coming with. Again, completely foreshadowing what the future exodus of the children of Israel from Egypt is meant to look like. They come down there. They're already fairly wealthy. Perhaps during the phase of the oppression, much of that gets taken away from them. They are told to ask for trinkets of gold and silver, changes of clothes, all manner of things, and they wind up plundering the Egyptians the night of the final plague, the Passover and whatnot, and they leave there far more wealthy than that generation perhaps had ever known. So a foreshadowing of the Exodus itself already happening in the beginning of Abraham's story. So what do I want you to take away from this? Much of Abraham's story in the near 11 chapters that we have of him, from 12 through 22 in Genesis, we're going to see these themes recycled in the actual much longer and far broader story arc of the children of Israel. God is playing out through the progenitor of this nation what he is going to do for his people. And the reason why he wants these things to stick in their mind is so that they understand his character, they appreciate his attributes at a far deeper level, and it's creating perhaps a skit or a dress rehearsal, if you will, that will be recycled in their minds for generations to come as they continue to relive this story annually. If you think about it, their liturgical calendar pretty much is oriented around Passover. And the 3 observed feasts that are supposed to happen with the entire congregation coming together at the place that God would choose, which later on would be Jerusalem, are all centered around Passover. It starts with Passover. 50 days later, you've got Shavuot or Pentecost. And then you've got the Feast of Tabernacles, which observes the time they were out in the wilderness. It starts with Passover. It mimics the Exodus. Every generation of Israelites every year gets to experience what their ancestors did when they left out of Egypt. And all of that points toward the ultimate Exodus that all humanity is going to get to partake in, with Israel at the head as the lead nation. All right. The story, or the language of the story, has far deeper connections. I mean, think about it. Genesis 15, at one of these points when God shows up to Abraham to address some of his concerns and doubts, he reminds Abraham, I am the Lord who brought you up out of Ur of the Chaldeans. Think about where Ur is and the fact it's in the Mesopotamian River Valley. Abraham's story begins right at the tail end of the dispersion of nations at the Tower of Babel, and God is calling Abram out of the exile of the nations to start the exodus of all humanity. Because again, Genesis 12, All peoples will be blessed through Abraham and his family. It's not a coincidence then when we get to Exodus 20 and God is meeting with his people at Sinai and is commissioning them, giving them the Torah through Moses. He says the exact same phrase. I'm the Lord your God who brought you up, not out of Ur this time, but out of Egypt. And basically Egypt has taken the place of Babylon in the Babel story. And it's launching into, again, a greater version of the Exodus. The language of the story has even deeper connections. We go outside of just the story of Abraham, and we find how it connects even to the creation and the flood stories themselves. If we go back to creation, think about it. In Genesis 1, we've got God calling creation out of the primordial water, allowing heavenly luminaries to start lighting up the place, and then he brings dry land out and provides all the order and complexity necessary for humanity to live in a now sustainable habitat for them. God basically undoes all of that and redoes it again through the flood story of Noah. What about when we get to the end of this Exodus journey? Why is it so important that we have this dramatic scene of the children of Israel crossing through the Red Sea? Couldn't they just have went around it? What was the point of all that? Going back to these stories. Because what was a obstacle that was completely insurpassable for them now becomes a twofold thing. It becomes a channel and walls of life for Israel, and it becomes a conduit and walls of death for Egypt. It delivers the final blow to Egypt in bringing complete disorder and chaos to their created world, the empire they made for themselves, and it brings new creation for God's people being delivered basically out of the womb of Egypt. If we can see these connections, man, we can start to make a lot of deeper applications for our students. Basically, as I have for you on the right side of the screen, the gist of it would be out of dark and chaotic water, seen in all of these stories, especially with the Exodus from Egypt, and the circumstances there, God brings forth a new creation, and with all of those, a leader for his people. The creation story culminates with God making the man. He's supposed to be king and priest. He is supposed to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, watch, guard, keep this sacred space God put him in. Noah has a completely renewed earth, does the same thing. God gives the same commands of be fruitful and multiply. First thing Noah does, builds an ark, a totally priestly function. And that after this process of them being birthed out of Egypt through the crossing of the Red Sea, God has already got his man, Moses, and now through Moses, he's commissioning these people in many of the same ways as being a kingdom of priests and so forth, and we'll unpack that a little later on. All right. And then with this, the goal that comes through the Exodus becomes a little clearer. We kind of talked about some of these things before, so I won't spend too much time on them. I'll just say that each of these are set up with the same idea in mind, that God in each of these stories is giving a space, and with the people involved, he's giving them a commission. Just mention the idea of what happened in Eden with Adam and Eve and what he had told them to do. The royal mandate of Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, and then the priestly mandate of Genesis chapter 2, verse 15. So if God sets the ideal standard in the beginning, the creation story of sacred space and God dwelling with man, man filling the space with image bearers, reigning and subduing over God's creation, and filling the space with more image bearers who will do the same thing and represent creation before God and God before creation in this priestly manner, which he says when he puts them in the garden, I want you to work, and I want you to watch, and I want you to keep. Those priestly terms that we've talked about before. God doesn't shelve this theme when Genesis 3 happens and they rebel, and then we don't see it again. It just keeps getting recycled over and over again. Again with Noah in the post-flood world. Abraham has the same commission. He is told to go to a land. So God has an ideal sacred space for Abraham and his children to eventually fill up, with an idea in mind of this being the meeting point, the nexus, if you will, of virtually all the nations in Genesis chapter 10 and the way that they integrate and interface with each other. Basically, it's the cross point of the ancient world. And God doesn't tell Abraham in verse 3 of chapter 12 in Genesis how he is going to be a blessing to all the peoples. And certainly we know that Jesus is the tip of the spear. But there's a lot of spear in between the beginning when this promise is given before we get to Jesus and how God continues to develop this theme. So that's what I want you to try to capture. That's what I hope that you're starting to emphasize to your students in the story, is that we're not just simply skipping all the rest of the narrative to get to Jesus. The idea of this being called the gospel project is seeing how God is laying down the themes, the seed bed for the growing of the fruits that will come from this that ultimately leads to the Jesus story. But if we've seen how through the failures, the struggles, the trials, and the momentary successes along the way, that God has shown his approval towards certain things and condemned other things, he truncates, he prunes off the branches of fruit that he does not want as part of his people and what their mission is, that helps clarify the mission that Jesus gives to his people. And we see a recycling of many of these things. All right, Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20. When Jesus says, go make disciples, he's taking the ideal of Canaan being sacred space for Israel and removing the borders and saying, go, take this sacred space and launch it out to the world. That's what he's doing there. It deeply connects to this Exodus ideal rather than just, yeah, that's a nice fluffy story in the Old Testament, but now let's get to the real meat and potatoes of what this kingdom mission is all about. It's connected in every way. All right. The goal is to recapture the intent of Eden in a new space. We kind of move the focus to Egypt for a little while with Joseph because God tells Jacob it's okay to go down there. And he flourishes them. He makes them multiply exponentially in a seemingly very short period of time. It's like God almost takes the idea of what he wants to happen eventually in Canaan and moves it down to Egypt. That should create questions in our mind, and we're about to dive into that kind of stuff tomorrow. So maybe if you can hold on to a few of these things, you might have something to throw at your students that you perhaps weren't already prepared to tomorrow. But it's not that God is taking the shift of focus away from Canaan so that Egypt now becomes the center point of the story. It's kind of like, think about the way a football game works and the fact that, well, I realize not everybody in here might be sports fans and may not totally get my analogy. I think most of us kind of have a general idea of how football games are played, in that before every play, the defense might get in a huddle, might not, but the offense, they always get in a huddle. They bring their players together. They're going to yell out some weird names, colors, and numbers and whatever else so that all of their players know exactly what they're supposed to do because they've rehearsed this and practiced over and over and over again. And now it's the time to put it into live gameplay, to go out on the field and over the next 5 to 10 seconds, we're going to execute this play that hopefully advances the ball, maybe results in a touchdown. It's the same idea here. God basically is bringing Israel down into Egypt, and in a very short time period, in the whole arc of the Joseph story, is giving them a full-fleshed synopsis of what he wants kingdom to look like. With his people, in a land that he has commissioned them to go to, he's made them aware of his approval of that. And then while there, God is blessing his own people. God is ultimately blessing the nations, being Egypt and all those who benefit from what Joseph did in saving up food over the 7 years of plenty before the 7 years of disaster happens. And then after all of that, God brings the chaos necessary for them to want to leave Egypt and go to the land that God ultimately said, I have reserved for you because of my promise to your father, Abraham. But when you get there, this is what I'm shooting for. A kingdom that blesses the nations. Blesses my people and blesses the nations. And then ultimately, that's what's supposed to happen when Israel goes into Canaan. And this is why the prophets just cannot let this whole Exodus theme go. You think about it. The psalmist says in Psalm 80, notice the Garden of Eden language there. You dug up a vine from Egypt, you drove out the nations, and you planted it. Think about a weed thatch that you've got at your house that you want to put a beautiful garden in. You got to get out the power tools, the garden rakes. You've got to get violent with what you need to do to make that space completely renovated and habitable for what you want to plant in its place and the lush fruit or whatever botanical product you want to come from that space that you have made ready for what you're intending to plant there. You drove out the nations and you planted the vine. Israel, you plucked up from Egypt. You cleared a space for it. It took root and it filled the land. We get down to the bottom of it. It sent out sprouts toward the sea and shoots toward the river. So eventually it does what it's supposed to in that it tentacles out and starts to fill up this space. It's like God has recreated Eden right there in Canaan. But notice when you get to the words of guys like Isaiah, they pick up this theme and they run with it too, but it's not in the way that brings any sort of glory to Israel. Because he says in this vineyard parable, What more could I have done for my vineyard, meaning Israel, that I planted in the land? When I expected a yield of good grapes, why did it yield for me worthless grapes? And so God is pronouncing that he's going to wind up bringing judgment. But you see those themes over and over and over again in the prophets. And it's not a bad idea, folks, if as teachers we start to bring these things in now while we're just jumping into the Exodus story. Because when we wind up getting to the prophets, you know how the Gospel Project writers wind up formulating our lessons. We're not going to spend an exuberant amount of time in either Isaiah, Ezekiel, or Jeremiah. We're going to have a quarter in which some of those prophets are excerpted for us in the lessons. So you have the freedom now to start bringing those themes into this now so that you can get that big meta-narrative working for you. Yeah, God's just starting the Exodus right here, but look how it winds up ending in the end. And that's why God is using this theme for talking about how he's ultimately planning on renewing and redeeming Israel, even though he kind of did that back here in the book of Exodus, but how it's going to ultimately finish out with them being renewed and all humanity being renewed, and there will not be another Exodus after that. And before we even actually get into them occupying the land, we see that God projects for them that there is going to have to be a whole new exile followed by a whole new Exodus. I give you here Deuteronomy 31, where the Lord speaking through Moses is projecting what's going to happen on the horizon for these people. He says, they will abandon me. They will break my covenant. They will prostitute themselves out with the foreign gods of other nations. And ultimately, God says, not that I may, but pronounces declaratively, I will abandon them and hide my face from them. Moses is saying this before they've actually even finished the first Exodus. If they haven't gotten into the land of Canaan yet, then the whole story from beginning to end, as God said it was supposed to end, with Moses at the burning bush, I'm sending you to bring them out and to take them to the land of all of those nations that end with the ites, and I'm going to give them this land that's flowing with milk and honey. 40 years later, they're not there yet, and God is saying, ultimately, this Exodus, in a sense, will fail, but there's hope on the horizon for what God is going to do with the final Exodus. Again, back in Deuteronomy 28, we see how God is picturing what his judgment upon his people in the land is going to look like. He says, the Lord will afflict you with the boils of Egypt. You will find no peace among those nations. The whole idea is that the Exodus is supposed to end with this new people, with new covenant in a sense, because as I've mentioned before, the covenant that God gives to Adam passes on to Noah through Abram, who becomes Abraham, and that now Moses is mediating with the people is one and the same covenant. It's just that God is expanding upon that covenant. But a new humanity in a new creation space with a new sense of covenant purpose and relationship with God, and yet basically they wind up becoming just like the Egypt that they left. And that's why God is pronouncing through Moses, if you don't adhere to the covenant that I gave you, if you don't hold your end of the bargain up, then I'm going to bring the plagues of Egypt upon you. He gets specific with it, boils and sores and various other things. They are supposed to find rest in the land. We know through the writings of Moses, they don't ultimately find that rest. And the writer of Hebrews in the New Testament picks up on that theme, that they entered the land but never found the Sabbath rest that God intended. This is ultimately what the kingdom that Messiah brings, and the Exodus he walks all humanity through, beginning with his ethnic people, Israel, is supposed to culminate in. That's why this final Exodus is one that's Messiah-driven. We get to the writings of somebody like Ezekiel. He uses this kind of language in the 37th chapter, the Valley of Dry Bones vision, when he says, I'm going to open up your graves, because this initial phase of Exodus ends with them basically dying, in a sense, being cast out of the land. But the new Exodus is launched with a resurrection. It's pictured with this valley of dry bones and all of these bodies coming together and God breathing into them, kind of mimicking exactly what happened in Genesis chapter 1, and then saying this is what's going to happen with the new kingdom era when Messiah, where we have in verse 24, my servant David will be kingdom or king over them. Messiah, descended from David, will be the one who launches this new era of exodus from exile, new creation, and new covenant, which is something else that Ezekiel talked about. So hopefully this is all kind of starting to blend together for us. I'm about to wind this one to a close, so just stay with me here for a second. And ultimately what we get is a new and final exodus for all humanity that begins with the renewal of Israel. So if we're looking at the big story arc of the Bible, here we are finishing up Genesis, now they're in Egypt, and then God launches the Exodus story with a couple of centuries passing by. They're oppressed, enslaved. God sends a deliverer. He brings them out of Egypt. He projects for them a beautiful vision of the future, but it never gets fully realized because these people stumble all along the way. Obviously, this is a story that the rest of humanity that walked away from God back in Genesis chapter 10 and 11 can identify with, because all the rest of the nations are in exile away from God, waiting for Exodus. God is going to project and lead Exodus for all humanity with Israel at the helm, all right? We get to a place like Isaiah 35. Isaiah has been preaching about the upcoming cataclysm, Babylon coming to judge God's people, and that they are going to be carted off into exile. But he, like his counterparts, obviously not contemporaries, Isaiah is prophesying about 200-ish years or so before guys like Jeremiah and Ezekiel come along. But nonetheless, right along with them, they project a picture of the future. Isaiah 35 gives a beautiful synopsis of this, using almost the exact same kind of picture that you have of what God is saying through Moses is coming for his people when he delivers them from Egypt. The wilderness, the dry land will be glad. The desert will rejoice and blossom like a wildflower. It will blossom abundantly, and it will also rejoice with joy and singing. The eyes of the blind will be opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped. The lame will leap like a deer. The tongue of the mute will sing for joy. Those words should sound very familiar. John the Baptist was one. Jesus the one, or do we wait for another? He sends the remnant of his disciples to question him about this. And what does Jesus say as goes how he identifies himself with Messiah? He virtually gives these same words here in telling his disciples, go back and tell John, the blind see, the deaf hear, the lepers are cleansed, the dead are even raised, right? He uses this Exodus deliverance language to show John, yes, this is exactly what was supposed to happen. Exodus before the final judgment that John had been preaching. And that's why, of course, when you get to a place like Matthew, we see John coming in the way that he did. Because when he was always asked the question, who are you? Are you Messiah? Are you that prophet? Are you Elijah, Jeremiah, come back from the dead? He says no, and he always carries them back to Isaiah 40. The first 3 verses, I'm the voice of the one crying out in the wilderness, telling you all, I'm here to make the paths of the Lord straight. Why? Exodus is about to begin. For John, Exodus and judgment was all going to happen simultaneously. Jesus obviously pushes those 2 bookends apart and has given us the last 2 millennia of this space of his kingdom to grow and to flourish. But the idea, nonetheless, is an opening of the way for repentance and, of course, restoration to happen, beginning with Israel. That's why John is in the Jordan. John doesn't go to the Sea of Galilee, nor does he go to the Dead Sea. His entire ministry publicly is right there at the Jordan River, because that's the place where the Exodus ends. It ends with them on the precipice of the eastern edge of the river. The entire book of Deuteronomy is given there. And then when Moses dies and Joshua takes over, it's through the Jordan River into the land to finish the thing out, to arrive at the final kingdom destination God intends to make this new sacred space, a new Eden for his kingdom to grow and flourish. John starts baptizing in the Jordan, and Jesus is baptized there to basically do the same thing, to say we need to go back to where this whole Exodus thing ended and realize we got it wrong, but the one who comes after me is the one who's going to make the real final one happen. And that's why Jesus says to John, hey, I thought you should be baptizing me, not the other way around. And he looks at him and he says, that's why it's become us to have to fulfill all righteousness, because it's upon us now to initiate the final phase of this Exodus that begins with Israel, because John is sent as a prophet to preach to them, but ultimately it's supposed to tentacle out to all the nations. I'll just read you a little bit from Isaiah 2 at the bottom left of the screen for you. In the last days, of which Peter says at Pentecost have already started, in the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house will be established at the top of the mountains and be raised above the hills. That does not mean that Jerusalem is going to be topographically elevated in a literal sense above all the mountains. Mountains and hills, as you see littered throughout the pages of the Old Testament, are sacred spots where shrines, altars are built. The temple of the Lord, or his mountain, Jerusalem, becomes the primary worship site. That's the idea behind Isaiah's poem. It'll be raised above all the hills. All the nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, let's go up to the mountain of the Lord, in the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us about his ways. Instruction will go out from Zion and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And then there's this language about kind of universal peace. They don't war anymore or train for it. They beat their swords into plowshares. One thing I think that's beautiful and interesting about this is that Micah, who's a contemporary of Isaiah, uses the exact same words. I hope you can follow me on this. If not, then write questions down and we'll get to it later on in our workshop session, or we can stop now and hash it out. But the very words that I gave you from Isaiah 2 are the same words that that Micah opens chapter 4 of his works with. He literally says the exact same thing verbatim. But back to Isaiah for a second on the left side of the screen. Isaiah says, the pride of mankind will be humbled, human loftiness will be brought low. This is all in this universal peace era that Messiah is supposed to bring. The Lord alone will be exalted on that day, for a day belonging to the Lord of armies is coming against all that is proud and lofty. Now, go over to Micah. After he's used the exact same verses for the first 3 verses of the 4th chapter, we get to this. Micah, speaking about the same time, says that on that day, that is the Lord's declaration, I will assemble the lame and gather the scattered, those I have injured. I will make the lame into a remnant, those far removed into a strong nation. The Lord will reign over them in Mount Zion from this time on and forever. You will go to Babylon. There you'll be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you from the grasp of his enemies. The point I want to make is this. If Isaiah and Micah are using the exact same verses to open up each of these chapters with, and they are supposed to point to the same thing, arguments can be made that they might be pointing to different points in the future. One to the coming day of the Lord in Babylon, one to the ultimate final day of the Lord in the future. But if they're both pointing to the same time, Micah references this as happening when Babylon comes. So there's a big exile looming on the horizon for them, and then the Messianic era is what will come after they leave exile in Babylon. And when the Messianic era comes and they have a king like David, a shepherd over them, these are the things that you can anticipate will happen. He says, I will bring the lame out. I will gather a remnant who will come from this place. And the Lord will reign over them from Mount Zion from this time on and forever. And what happens at the end of Jesus' story arc in all the Gospels? When he ascends to heaven, he completes what happens in Daniel 7, verses 13 and 14, when he is at the right hand of the Father, and he is crowned king over the cosmos. He rules cosmically over everything. So in a sense, perhaps Isaiah and Micah are pointing us to what was going to happen when Messiah comes and he brings the kingdom into its inauguration phase. Obviously, we haven't reached the full fruition of that, but it all points to the idea that Messiah is going to be the one who brings about an Exodus period. I realize that's perhaps a bit meaty and might need further exploration, hence the reference there for you to look at later. Now, the structuring of the Gospels. I'll be brief with this. Down here on the lower left-hand corner of the screen, this is the commonality of what you see as the beginning point of all the Gospels, minus John. John has a few points of commonality, but let's just put John off to the side for the second. I'm talking about the Synoptics, the structure of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. For some of those, like Matthew and Luke, you get birth narrative stuff, a flight down to Egypt, which of course is supposed to mimic the idea of Exodus, and the visitation of shepherds, magi, and Luke's material and whatnot. But most of these Gospels begin with Jesus' Galilean ministry and ends with Jesus going to Jerusalem. John is the only Gospel writer who mentions Jesus going to Jerusalem 3 times. Every one of the other Gospel writers have it just once, and that's when Jesus enters into the city at the beginning of his Passion Week, fulfilling the Zechariah 9 prophecy, right? And notice here on the left side, meaning this side of this little broken path I've given you, these are the events that happen in the Gospels. On the other side of that broken path are things within the actual Exodus story, from Exodus through the end of Deuteronomy, that also parallel with the things that happen in the Gospels. So if we watch the journey of Jesus from the beginning of his ministry in Galilee until his final conquest in Jerusalem, now there's a reason why I put that in quotes, but I'll get to that in a second, then you pretty much have the exact same portrayal by all of these gospel writers of Jesus being baptized in the Jordan, which is kind of mimicking Joshua leading the people through the river Jordan to take the land. Jesus chooses 12 disciples. Both Moses and Joshua speak to the tribal heads of each of these 12 tribes and give them their tribal allotments. So while Jesus is not taking 12 disciples and saying, I want you to go here, 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 and here to conquer the land, he sends them out to all the world. In a sense, it's meant to hearken back to that, because now Canaan is the world, as goes the end of the gospel story. Jesus is teaching, I was getting confused. Jesus teaches Torah, and I use Torah in quotes because it's a broader term, meaning wisdom, instruction. Jesus gives that in the Sermon on the Mount, of course, but all throughout the rest of the Gospels, he's teaching Torah to his disciples as Moses taught Torah to Israel. Jesus announces the arrival of the kingdom. Moses told the people, you are to be a kingdom of priests, and on and on and on it goes, right? Eventually it ends in the conquest of Jerusalem with the showdown of the ideal of kingdom with the religious and political leaders and Jesus' concept of kingdom. And it looks like they win because he dies, but obviously when he's raised from the dead, who's the one with the last laugh, right? The resurrection is tied very closely to the Passover. Think of this. The Exodus story in Egypt ends, 10th and final plague, Passover. Death of a substitute, the people leave. Why doesn't Jesus die at the time of the Day of Atonement? You would think that's probably the most prolific picture you can get. Why does it have to be tied to Passover? Because what comes after Passover? Exodus. You leave. But the disciples aren't leaving the land. They are staying right here to do what Isaiah said and Micah said in Isaiah 2 and Micah 4. From Zion is launched instruction to the world. The word of the Lord will come from here and be launched everywhere. So Passover leads to the Exodus. Jesus says in Acts, you'll be my witnesses starting in Jerusalem. You'll go everywhere. And then the Luke-Acts narrative finishes this for us when we get over to the gospel of going to the nations. And in fact, it's Luke himself. When we have Luke's account of Jesus being transfigured on the mountain, this is where we kind of get short-sailed when we read the Bible in English. If we were proficient at reading Greek and we read it regularly in Greek, this is what we would see reading the Greek New Testament. Luke says in Luke chapter 9, we have Jesus up on the mountain. He is surrounded by Moses and Elijah, who were the only two prophets who were up on the mountain of the Lord, Sinai, that we have record of. So that's hugely significant, considering that the three disciples Jesus brings with him, Peter, James, and John, awaken to the conversation that the glorified Jesus is having with these two prophets. And these two prophets are speaking with Jesus about his exodus. That's the highlighted word I give you there. Who had appeared with glorious splendor, and they were speaking of Jesus' departure, which in Greek is Exodus, which he was soon to accomplish at Jerusalem, because Passover will be observed, he will be crucified. Resurrection that comes after that is the initial phase of Exodus. He's leading, as Messiah, a new Exodus. It's right there in front of our noses by Luke, except in English, sadly, we don't get the word Exodus, we get departure. But when we do a little more study and digging, we can see these kind of connections. All right. The structure of the apocalypse. I got a lot up there on the screen, but I'm not going to cover all of that. I just want you to notice in this phase right here, we get the opening doxology in chapter 1, where John says, using the exact same language almost that Moses gives to the people in Exodus 19 and 20. John is saying that Messiah is the one to be praised because he has set us free from our sins by his blood, meaning he is the slain lamb, because he has consummated the final and ultimate Passover. Exodus can begin. And as the children of Israel come to Sinai, and Moses tells them, you're going to be a kingdom of priests, John is saying the same thing as what Jesus has made us. He's made us a kingdom of priests, or some translations will render it kings and priests. Right here, I didn't give you the exact references, but each one of these, if you're familiar with Revelation, all come from chapters 2 and 3. These are remarks that Jesus makes to one of the 7 churches. But notice the words that are given there. To the one who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna. To the one who conquers, I will give him authority over the nations. And the one who conquers, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. All of these relate directly to these excerpts from Exodus, where we have the manna being given, Moses telling the people that the nations will not rule you. Your destiny is to rule the nations, not in an oppressive, tyrannical way, but to bring blessing to the nations per the mandate that God gave Abraham. And then the same thing here with Deuteronomy 12, and that you are to assemble yourselves at the place the Lord God chooses. That's the whole concept of temple. Now, temple is with us everywhere we go. Then when you get to the places like the seals, the trumpets, the vials, notice the recycling of the Exodus language, as goes the plagues in Egypt, especially when you have the trumpets and the bowls. I've given them to you there as a summation. With both of those, you have things like hail, fire, blood, the water being defiled, darkness, locusts coming, or fire out of heaven. Why is it these themes get recycled? Why do we keep going back to the idea of Exodus? Because God's people are being brought through the turmoil of an Exodus that's meant to be the last one of its kind, that ultimately ends with a final renewed creation and God ruling and reigning amongst his people, literally dwelling with his people. Remember, that's why God gave them the tabernacle. He said, make them a sanctuary so that I may dwell among them. He says in Leviticus, I want to walk among you. That's why we have all this given to us in Revelation, because when we get the glorious city coming down, there is no temple. Why? Because God and the Lamb are there. And God's dwelling space is now with man. And the whole thing ends with the last two chapters and the culmination of new creation represented by a new Jerusalem. I would encourage you to go back and spend a little bit more time looking at that. And certainly we can do that in our workshop time. The Exodus becomes an archetype for the day of the Lord. I won't read over all these. I've highlighted the portions for you there by putting them in italics and underlining them, but notice the similarity between the language. Because here we have in Exodus a pronunciation of darkness coming. Amos is saying for those who are waiting for the day of the Lord, they are waiting for the day of the Lord in which God is going to judge the nations for their wickedness. Amos is saying, I don't know why you're waiting so expectantly for that, because you're going to become the target of God's judgment too. You are just as wicked as the nations are. So for you who are waiting expectantly for the day of the Lord, it will be a day of darkness for you. Why is the day of the Lord a day of darkness? Because the day of the Lord came upon Egypt in the Exodus story. It's going to become a day of the Lord archetype for what will happen at many points in the rest of the story. Case in point, you get here. Notice when we get to these places where Israel starts to turn wicked, and by this, I'm really referencing the idea of the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes. They wind up becoming Babylon. I wanted you to see here at the bottom of this slide that in the Exodus story, Egypt basically becomes like Babylon of Genesis 11. The Tower of Babel story, right? God brought judgment upon them. Granted, there are no plagues there. There's no turning water into blood or bringing flies and locusts and all this other stuff. But God brings judgment. It's a day of the Lord. Why did this happen? The pride of the people that led to their ultimate exile away from the Lord through the dispersion of these nations by God confusing their languages, right? Well, ultimately, Israel, the northern kingdom, after the split with Solomon's son Rehoboam, they wind up experiencing the same thing. Over the next 500 years or so, they become a kingdom and people who are so lifted up and vaunted in their pride toward God, they become like the people of Babel, Genesis 11, and God brings a day of the Lord judgment upon them. Assyria is the very tool that God uses to judge the northern kingdom. But notice what Isaiah says in Isaiah 10. Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger. I will command Assyria to go to destroy these people and execute my rage. But this is not what Assyria intends. That's not what he plans. Instead, he wants to cut off many nations. So what does God do? Because of Assyria's pride, he brings a day of the Lord, a judgment upon them. Same thing happens with Judah and eventually Babylon too. Babylon's the tool of God's judgment upon the southern kingdom of Judah, and then eventually God brings Babylon to their knees as well through a day of the Lord judgment. All right, that's a lot. A lot to digest. Again, that's the biggest topic we're going to be covering. So hopefully we'll get some good questions that come from that in the workshop time for anybody that might be still wondering. But at the moment, are there any questions that I could help answer or clarify now? All right. So another theme, Messiah. The first of the promises made to humanity comes in this verse we're all familiar with. I'll put hostility between you and the woman, between her offspring and her offspring. He will strike your head, you will strike his heel. When we see these archetypal figures, beginning with Adam, obviously this promise comes after Adam. Adam is the ideal of who and what Messiah will be. You've noticed here around this box, I've given you descriptive terms of what each of these other archetypes are ultimately supposed to be. Noah being a bringer of comfort. And in that long list of names that's given in Genesis 5, he's the only one that has anything said about him as goes what he's supposed to accomplish or why he's even being named Noah. And obviously that title or concept of him being a bringer of comfort is certainly something Messiah will slip into. But ultimately, while we can see Messiah being a bringer of comfort or a father of nations, a deliverer like Moses with all this Exodus stuff we just got done talking about, what I would say is that those are more or less the subplots in the idea of how the Gospels are structured and with the way that the apostles in their letters reference Jesus. Some of these things come back up, but we have much more dealing with the idea of Jesus being both king and priest. When we get to a place like 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul's saying he must reign until all enemies are subjected underneath him, and the last and final of those being death. Or, of course, all of the talk about Jesus' propitiatory, his substitutionary sacrifice as our Passover offering in our place. All that priestly stuff goes back to the ideal of Adam as the first man who can consider himself God's son in a sense, way back there. Now, I kind of touched on this here a second ago, the idea of why God is doing what he's doing in the Joseph story with referencing it to a football game and bringing it from scrimmage out to live play. This is what I want us to kind of understand. In Adam, before Genesis 3, this is what God intended, for Adam to image him. When God said, let us make man in our image, there are some things there that we can easily see as goes, God has creative attributes. We, in a sense, can create. We can't just rustle up dirt out of nothing like God can. But certainly we can take and add to the complexity that God has already made within the created order, correct? Obviously, there are other things that we can identify with as goes attributes. But the idea of imaging God in the Bible has nothing to do with the idea that God can be angry, so can I. God knows how to be happy, so can I. It has nothing to do with that. Imaging God is this. The idea that the first man was prophet, priest, and king. We can explore that a little later on if you're wondering, how was Adam a prophet? I would love to get into that with you. But for now, understand this is the ideal that Jesus is working back to. In these pictures of Joseph and Moses, we kind of see a piece of this working with Moses certainly serving as prophet and in a lot of ways a priest, and Joseph, of course, ruling and reigning as king. That's the reason why these stories are there, is so that we can see the image of God still working with broken human beings that come from Adam after the fall, that God does not shelf the idea of bearing his image until Jesus comes. We see how it works in some ways, and we still see how humanity fails and struggles at it, which is why when Jesus comes on the scene and he brings the whole thing together, it's like, wow, we've got the ideal fully restored back to us. And so in all of this, it's basically the same thing that I've given you as goes each three of these points, but I'll use Joseph as the first. Joseph is invited to lead God's covenant people. That's the dream. The whole reason he's given these dreams is to forecast to him, God knowing the dark future that's going to come from him, for him, with false accusations and various other things, that Joseph will have to unjustly suffer, but yet this is the hope that he wants him to cling to, is the idea that I have projected you to be a ruler over my people, and it's ultimately not just his own people, but all the nations gathered there in Egypt. Joseph works with the Lord to bring about the repentance and transformation of God's covenant people. Obviously, they're still afraid of Joseph's possible wrath after Jacob dies. They think that Jacob's the one restraining Joseph, and they come to him pledging themselves to be slaves. And Joseph simply says, look, I have already forgiven you. What you intended for evil, God meant for good, and it led to the saving of many lives. So your perspective on this needs to change. Doesn't justify what you did, but it ultimately led to God's plan being brought about. That's ultimately what God wants for his people. He wants the transformation of their hearts through the process of time. And we see Moses and Jesus working to these eventual goals themselves. I got a couple more slides, so bear with me and then I'll give you a break, okay? Ultimately, Moses leaves the people with a promise that the Lord will raise up a prophet for them who is like Moses. Just giving you a little bit of a brief synopsis of what that looks like. Exodus chapter 24 through 34, here we've got Moses away from the people. Moses enters up into the cloud that has descended upon Sinai. If you pay attention to the text, if you consider the idea that in Eden, heaven, God space, earth, man space have come together. They are colliding in the garden. Here we've got God, we've got man, we've got heavenly creatures like cherubim and all that amalgamated into one space where Adam has free access to God who freely walks among man. Here in this cloud that comes from heaven and is touching Sinai, and God is in the cloud, and Moses goes into the cloud and then goes up. It's basically like we have Eden all over again, where heaven and earth together are combined. So when Moses goes up into the cloud, for all intent and purpose, he's up in God's space, which we would say is heaven, all right? He's up there getting the instruction for the tabernacle, the tablets, all that stuff. But what's going on while he's up there? Down in Exodus 32, we've got Aaron, who has now become the figurehead of a rebellious group of people who want to make an image of their God and to celebrate the Exodus, which completely violates the law. Then in Exodus 34, after the end of Moses' 40 days and 40 nights, Moses descends the mountain for after that period's over with the tablets. Obviously, he breaks them. Judgment happens. He goes back up for another 40 days. He gets more Torah. Then he comes down. When we get to a place like Matthew 4, all of this is sandwiched together in the picture that Matthew gives us of Messiah. Think about it. Moses is up on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. Jesus is out in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. Now, yeah, Jesus is also kind of mimicking Israel's wilderness wandering, a day for a year for them, but it also brings this picture back into the synopsis too, because as Jesus is out in the wilderness, Moses out in the wilderness with his people, Jesus is communing with God, Moses is communing with God, Israel's down at the base of the mountain being tempted to violate the terms of the covenant, commit idolatry. Jesus is tempted by Satan. But whereas Israel stumbles and falls, Jesus prevails. What does he use to do that with? Torah. And when he comes down, after Matthew's story arc is over with and Jesus' 40 days and 40 nights ends, what does Jesus do? Goes up on a mountainside. His disciples, for the next 3 chapters, he gives them Torah. What is Moses doing when he comes down off the mountain? Giving them Torah. That's the reason why Moses is the backdrop of Matthew's story arc and his presentation of Jesus, is to show Jesus as the greater Moses and the beginning of a new Exodus. Moses is a Messiah-like figure, and Jesus is the ultimate antitype and fruition and fulfillment of that. I'll be brief with this. I've got a lot of busy slides here, and they look a lot like this, but I just want to point out a couple of things, okay? Because this is more or less for you to read later on rather than me simply explain it to you. Because in each of these slides, I hope you'll notice, I have kind of stylized Moses and then some other figure between Moses and Messiah, mostly David. Some places you might see Josiah there, because the reason why the story writers and Kings and whatnot and Chronicles mention or highlight guys like Hezekiah and Josiah is because they are Messiah-like figures. Consider the idea. Messiah comes from the Hebrew word Mashiach. Mashiach means anointed one. A king, just like David, who had oil poured on his head by Samuel, is an anointed one. The kings are considered Mashiachs. Having said that, his anointed one is supposed to lead the people, right? Lead the people in a righteous way, not oppressively exploit them or whatever the case might be. Moses, in a real way, idealizes this, and ultimately Messiah fulfills it. And we've got a few bright spots in between those stories, mostly with David and sometimes other kings. But one example would be Messiah will unify the tribes of Israel. He'll lead them into the promised land like a shepherd leads his sheep. Moses is told by the Lord in Exodus chapter 3, I'm choosing you. I want you to go and assemble the elders of Israel. Tell them what I've told you. I will bring you up from the misery of Egypt into the land of the Canaanites. God tells David when he's making his covenant promise with David, look, I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, to be ruler over my people. Now notice what the terminus end of this covenant is. I'll designate a place for my people Israel and plant them. What do you mean by that? That's weird. The people are already in Israel. Is God going to take them out of Israel and move them to a new place and plant them? Why is he talking like that? God knows the end. He's making it known all along the way. Ultimately, God wants rest for his people. It's not going to come in the time of David or any of these kings until Messiah comes. But in the covenant he makes with David, which is supposed to be a perpetual kinghood or kingship, an everlasting dynasty, that's the role Messiah steps into. That's why Ezekiel and others speak of this. In Ezekiel 37, my servant David will be king over them. Is David going to be raised from the dead? You and I both know that's not the case. Obviously, this is Jesus, who is the descended messianic ruler who's supposed to come from David, will be the one who starts this new Exodus and leads them, like Moses, who is the single shepherd over this massive flock of 1 million plus people. David will be king over them, and notice his language. And there will be one shepherd for all of them. They will follow my ordinances. They will keep my statutes and obey them. They will live in the land that I gave my servant Jacob. The Messianic era is supposed to see a time of obedience on the part of God's covenant people, and his sacred space, Canaan, being the place where they are planted. And again, Canaan now is the world, because that's what Paul's driving at in Romans 4, verse 13. Abraham was supposed to inherit the world, not just simply Canaan, expand this place, moving beyond the borders of this. I could go through the rest of these examples, but I would like for you to kind of spend some time chewing on that. Plus, we're at our hour break. So I'm going to give you all about a 5 to 10 minute break. I'm going to start in 5 minutes. If you're not in your seats, don't worry about it. I'm just going to keep on trucking on, and I know you'll eventually make it back here, all right?